of an interview is really to, of course, gather information about the candidate, what they can do, you know, what's their education, their experience, etc. And will do. Like Karen and I were talking about, you can hire somebody that matches the requirements and has those skills and education, whatever you need, experience, but will they do it? Is it a motivational fit? So it's really important when you interview to really focus heavily on that. Sometimes some recent studies in HR say, you know, that's what matters more than the skills, that you can train the skills. Of course, in your world, you've got to have people certified and all that, but in a lot of positions, you can train the skills, and it's the attitude that really counts. And so even if they don't have everything you need, maybe you can train them a little more. And the fit with the company and department and team. And we have to be really careful when we use the word fit, because that can also work against having a diverse group that reflects your customer base and so forth, and enriches an organization. But you also don't want to bring somebody in that will totally mess up the dynamics of the team, or that might, you know, or maybe you need to fill a gap. Maybe a team, they're all great at dealing with customers or something, but they're not so good at the more, you know, the book, the details or something, and you need somebody on the team to balance that out, you know. Or, so those are considerations as you hire. Can anybody else think of another key purpose to an interview?
Give them an opportunity to ask questions.
Great, yeah, to learn about the company. Mm-hmm. And that's, to that point, is you're also selling your organization, right? So you're not, they want to check you out, they want to ask questions, you want to let them know why it's valuable to work there. Of course, I'd be realistic. You don't want to oversell. You want to have good expectations, and you know, I've had managers who will say, "Oh, we're a growing organization. You'll be a senior manager in no time," and then that's what they expect. So you have to be careful about what you promise to, and making sure they really understand the positions, so that. And what's good and bad about them. You want to sell it, but you also say, and this, you know, this is the other side, so that it's realistic. They know what they're getting into. I remember when I went to WorldStrides, I was so relieved that the recruiter was not, she at the time was not, didn't keep a straight. I knew I was referred by the payroll person, so I guess I was a little bit of an insider. So they were very open with me about the bad side of everything at the company. You know, it was a great company, but these are the downsides, and it was like on the side, like whisper. So when I went there, I knew, well, that doesn't sound so bad to me. I can work around that, but I knew what to expect, so there was no shock. You know, the honeymoon lasted a long time, for the whole time. And of course, describing the company. Hopefully they've already researched your company. That's one of the first questions I usually ask is, what do you know about the company? Just to get a sense of, are their heart in this job? You know, I want to see what they know, and then I'll fill in the gaps, see what questions they have. Yeah, connecting their interest to the skill is one way to what their skills be used on the job is one way to sell it. Of course, there's a whole lot of preparation behind an effective interview. You want to make sure you have the updated job description, and that's how you want to design your questions around that job description, because hopefully that really covers competencies, skills, education, everything you need in there. An hour goes fast. If you have an hour interview, 8 to 12 questions. I've seen people come with 30 and think they're going to squeeze them all in, and that doesn't happen. Most candidates, I usually put a few extra in the pocket, because some candidates are very to the point. You've seen that. Others you've got to really kind of take charge of and channel and learn how to be what they call it, the great interrupter or something like that. Learn how to interrupt and redirect them if they're going off on a tangent. Especially when people are nervous, sometimes they tend to do that more. And asking open-ended questions, because you really want to hear from the candidate. You know, the vast majority of point to that later, probably say that more than once. The time should be, at least 80% should be the candidate talking, because that's where you learn. And if you can get it more conversational, you learn more about the person. Things come out. So ask in the open-ended questions. Tell me about, describe, give me an example. Why, how. It's best to have a standard set of questions for multiple reasons. One, you're comparing apples to apples. That way, and you can always probe deeper based on the candidate. And you're going to have some custom questions based on their resume and experience, of course, like if they have a gap. Feel free to jump in if you have questions. Sometimes you don't want to ask questions that aren't like directly relevant to the job requirements, of course, education. If you don't need a degree, I don't know how much you need to know that, because if it's highly preferred or required, you might want to put it in there. Behavioral-based questioning many people are strong believers in that, because the past behavior, of course, is the best indicator of what they'll really do in the future. Have you ever noticed when you interview that the candidates often go to, well, what I would do is, in a situation, and so some of your skills as an interviewer will be to get them to say, okay, oh great, that's what you would do, but can you give me a real example? Take time you need to think about it, and hopefully they can come up with one. And it doesn't have to be on the job. You can remind them if you don't have an example from your past job, maybe there's an organization you worked with, volunteered for, your church or something else. Well, I wouldn't say get into the church, but another organization where you've shown that in volunteering, that skill. So, and this is something I learned way back in the LexisNexis days, is really trying to look too at the outcome. Like they give you an example, but you don't know if they were really successful. Like how did you deal with a difficult customer? Have you ever dealt with one? First, you want to make sure. And they probably have if it's a customer service type position and they have that experience. Then how did you handle it? And they'll tell you how they handled it. And sometimes you move on to the next question. You don't even know. Well, what happened? Was the customer happy? Did they return? And those are probing questions you could ask to make sure you understand. And another thing is a lot of times they'll say, we, did such and such, and it turns out it was their manager that really ended up resolving the issue. Or you want to find out what their role was in it, and how much was on their shoulders. And then think about how many interviews. How many of you do more than one interview now? And I realize in some worlds there might be some positions, you need them in the door, you need them fast. But then you got to realize if you hire fast, you're probably going to have to fire fast. So you're going to have more difficulties. It's going to take a lot more money and time and energy to fulfill the position. So the more touches you have to a candidate, the more odds you're going to see the real person, to really understand, to start connecting the dots. When I interview, I start out with the resume and I think, what do I want to really know about? What's gaps based on my requirements are there potentially with this person? And then every time I talk to them, I think, okay, there's a little red flag here. Let me see if I see it again. Like they weren't so nice to the receptionist. Let me see if they're just nervous. We'll see how they do next time they come in, and you watch and you see it. And then you can ask questions, dig into that when you get to a related question, and references. When you do job references after, that's something else you might dig into. So the more touches, again, the better. And so we recommend at least 2 rounds, and plus the reference checks and other things. And it depends on the position. And we do, how many of you do like a phone pre-screen ahead of time or video. That saves a lot of time, especially if you have a lot of candidates. And so we'll do that. A lot of times HR handles that, then we turn the finalist over to the managers. Just actually how I pretty much worked it in my job. Sometimes I'm more involved. So that can narrow it down, be more like a 15, 30 minutes, 20 minutes. And you found out, you've seen their communication skills, you've asked some fundamental questions, you made sure maybe, I usually tell them at that point, some people don't believe in that. The salary range is this, is that in your ballpark? I don't want them to feel like they have to have a big discussion like that, but you get some sense and they know up front so that you don't get to the third interview and offer and they're like, what? And then what type of additional measurements can you like this is can you come up with, or have you tried that you found successful? Like this is one funny one, you know, where the IKEA actually had to make a chair, because I guess that would be part of the job for them to sit on.
Okay. Well, for us, because our company being a recycle center, we have many, many different departments, and some of them, well, actually all but one is actually requires a specific skill set. So instead of asking them about their prior experiences, we say, show me. You know, we don't bother a lot with the resume. It's like, if you're going to be a CDL driver, get in the truck and let's go. If you say you're a welder, here, weld it. So we actually can see for ourselves that the skill sets are actually what they state it is on their resume, which in a lot of cases can be overinflated. You know. Exactly.
Yep. Great. Yep. Yeah. If it's a position where you can do that, that's wonderful. You can't, like for HR, that's hard to do. Have them go out and do something, but what else might you do for that type of position or other positions? Any other ideas of things you've tried?
Could do a role play.
Role plays are awesome. Yeah. Especially like a sales position or customer service. Well, that's even like a manager handling or HR handling a difficult situation, employees. Here's some others that we do. Behavioral assessment. So there's some, like you might have heard of DISC or Myers-Briggs, that are not made for hiring. They're not validated for that or recommended for use for that. But there's others like the predictive index. And then we use a consultant that does what's called a BSA, behavioral strategies assessment, on most positions, not all, because it's expensive but worth it, because he actually interviews the person too. He meets with them to validate the profile. So those can be really helpful, and too, that can help you figure out what red flags might be there that we don't do that until they're a finalist because of the cost. Predictive indexes, if you buy them in bulk, they're less expensive, and some of the others out there, I'm not promoting any particular product, but those are just some I'm familiar with. But it's a quick thing, and it could say you never want to base a decision legally on an assessment, but it can be another piece of information to help make a decision. Like, you're not really sure if the person can really take charge and lead and make decisions and be decisive. You've seen you're wondering about that, and their profile says, oh, they're much more a team player, or they need directions. You know, you can test that more. And not that people can't flex, they can, but that gives you a little something else to study more and to check into in the references or interviews. Yeah, demonstration, which Karen said, depending on the position. A set of scenarios about how they respond. That's a real good one for like HR type people or managers. You know, a written scenario. Like one of the interviews I actually went to at UVA I was being interviewed. They gave us, when we walked in, they told you to come early. You were handed a sheet with scenarios written out, and you had time to think through them and work on them. And then in the interview, you talk through it. So, create a spreadsheet if they're going to have to use a lot of spreadsheets. And you want to be consistent with each candidate if you do that. You don't want to change directions on the spreadsheet. You know, it needs to be consistent, so you're legally and fairly, it's apples to apples. Marketing positions, often ask people to share, a graphic designer or something, share their work, and websites, or a lot of the portfolios now are online versus being brought to you, of course. Role play. And we already talked about references, and you might include some other background checks and things depending on the position. Any questions? Other thoughts?
I have a question. I don't know if this is quite on that subject, but you mentioned in that one interview being able to sort of review the scenarios ahead of time. Is that something that you sort of recommend for an interviewing process, maybe giving the candidates a little chance to prepare?
Yeah.
To let them know what to expect in the interview?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the scenarios for one. These are very complex and long, and it seemed fair, but if it's a shorter scenario, and you want to maybe test their ability to think on their feet, because they're going to have customers walking in, and you got to figure out in the scenarios about how you would deal with them, then you want to want the spontaneous. Any other thoughts about that?
I've never had where they told you to come early to do. I mean, I kind of like that being an interviewee. I've had where they have just given me scenarios in an interview, and kind of it feels kind of like everybody's kind of watching you read your scenarios, and it's a little stressful trying to like think through it there. But I guess that's the whole point to it is, you know, how do you respond to the stress of that? But yeah, so I've experienced it in that matter, but I've never experienced like coming early and having time to read through it and do like that.
Yeah. And if that's realistic to the job, the scenario is going to take time to build. You're going to have time to talk with other people about it and think about it, you know.
Yeah.
Then, yeah. So okay, now the fun stuff. The legal, the kind of what you don't ask or didn't say or do. And this is very brief. I mean, at UVA, our class for managers, our lawyers taught it, and it was like half day long. And so this is a very brief version. They hit on some highlights, some key things, and anybody on the interview team that you have should be at least at a minimum aware of this, so that they don't step into mud. I've seen that happen, like the hiring managers train, but they're, you know, the senior person they bring in the room too isn't, and so they fall into mud. Luckily, I've never had any big issues, legal issues in my whole career, but they happen, apparently the lawyers tell us, especially like age. Age is a big one right now. Ginger's coming up there. So these are I just combined the federal and Virginia protected classes. It's easier to remember that way instead of showing them separately. But so race, color, religion, national origin, sex, including gender identity, of course, nowadays, and age, 40 and older, physical or mental disability, marital, even pregnancy, of course, family status, are they married or not, that type of thing, do they have kids or not, and veterans, genetic information, citizenship. Any questions about any of those categories? So these are the protected ones. So you don't want to ask any questions that may be construed as getting at one of these factors unless it's an essential function of your job. You know, you have a business where your females are all do this certain role. Well, you need a female. And there's a good reason for it.
Do you have a good recommendation for what if the candidate brings up any of those things, how to steer away from it or navigate
so
that conversation?
If somebody mentions their kid, I actually try to show, like, excited, oh, nice, and then move on to another topic.
boom.
Yeah. Get off of it, yeah. I mean, it doesn't feel natural, especially in the more informal moments, like when you greet the candidate and you walk in to give them some water and you're chatting, you know, or if you take them to lunch at a later interview or something, that's, you know, it's a little harder. It's all a matter of risk, right? It's, you want to be human and all that, so it might come up, but just know that if that candidate got mad later, it could come back to haunt you in some way. So it's a balance, I think, of being human and showing warmth and moving on. It's safest to move on. The lawyer would tell you move on to another. Anybody else?
Well, and it's just so ironic, we just had a candidate come in, and when it comes to interviews, I'm really picky on being on time or early. Because to me, if you can't make it to an interview on time, and there's no good reason, because it could always be a good reason, right? And they haven't contacted me already, that's the biggest red flag ever. So I had this one girl come in, she was only maybe 5 minutes late. She says, I am so sorry I'm late. She says, but my kids had a problem because, oh my God, I am going through hell with my daughter. And I'm like, all right, TMI, stop talking. You know, so she's volunteering, not only, number one, what has she told me? She has children. She has problems with her kids. And so there's issues there. And from an HR perspective, as much as we want to move on, it's hard to make believe you haven't heard it. It really is very difficult to disregard what they have volunteered.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Yeah, but you got to do your best and be consistent with what, you know, if being punctual is a key part of the position.
Yes.
Then make sure that's in your question plan so that you're asking every candidate that question and not just the one that came in. You know, might have come in a flutter and with all kinds of issues. So that type of thing. So.
We do have a couple positions that is, so to be on our insurance with our company, you have to be a certain age limit to be qualified for our insurance to drive our company vehicles. How would you address that in an interview? That's always kind of like where I'm kind of like stuck at, like I kind of dance around it because I don't want to get into a position where I've offered a position and then they give me their driver's license and then I know their age and then they're not qualified to drive our company vehicles.
Yeah, I think you can ask it this way. You can to every candidate. You know, the minimum age to drive this vehicle is 15. Do you meet that qualification?
Okay, that's kind of what we do now. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't breaking any kind of HR.
Because that's a requirement, an essential requirement of the job. No way to work around it, right?
Right.
So
okay.
It's fair game.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's without asking their actual age.
Right.
That's good.
Okay.
For you to, So again, any questions directly or indirectly that get at any of those protected classes, you should try to avoid unless essential function of the job. Anne-Marie said in about a week that these will be posted online, so if you want to get a copy, you have access. So, yeah, again, making sure it's bona fide. Another example is lifting. You know, do they really have to? You know, maybe if they only have to lift 50 pounds a few times a year to go to a conference or something, there's ways to accommodate that if they can't lift. So don't ask it unless it's more of a regular, absolute function of the job. Is everybody kind of familiar with that term, essential function of the job? I keep throwing that out. Yeah, it kind of determines for ADA purposes too, whether, you know, and it's always recommended that you spell that out in your job descriptions too, what's absolutely essential. It makes it more legally sound if you want to do that. So again, you can ask the question if it's job related, consistent to every candidate, objective and verifiable. We can verify that that person really has to be 15 to drive.
Right.
Obviously, yeah. All right, pop quiz time.
Okay.
Before we move on to onboarding, where are you from? Can you ask that?
No.
No. Well, how do we know if they're eligible to work in the U.S.?
Are you eligible to work in the
Good. Good. That's what matters, right? Not where. What year did you graduate from college? No. People leave it off their resumes nowadays. Their high school, college. So, what do you do outside of work? It's not smart, right? Not smart. A lot of people ask it because they want to, that type of question, because they want to get to know the whole person. So it's all a balance of risk. Because if they start bringing up, I'm a member of X church and I'm very involved and that's what I do all the time, then they could think you might discriminate against them if they're not selected against that. Or maybe they talk about politics or family. So it's a risky question. I advise people not to leave, especially not to do it at the beginning. Maybe when you get further and you build trust and all that, but still there's risk. I found Virginia too, like because I've been in companies and the current one where you have hiring other states and something like California where they're very protective of employees. It feels a lot more like people are watching than in Virginia. So I think some of that depends on where you're recruiting. Does anybody recruit outside of Virginia in here? Okay. Maiden name? Because why?
Marital status.
Did you have a gap? Why did you have a gap in your employment? You look at the resume, you see a few-year gap. It's okay. Yeah. That's fair. You may get something like, oh, I was sick, really sick, Alan. But you need to know why there are gaps in most cases, most jobs. You want to know.
That's the questions that usually you look through the resume, they skip on it.
They'll skip up some
years. The gap. And it doesn't, as an employer, you need to know actually what's happened to that. Well, they could be fired, could be, took off from somewhere.
In jail for laundering money.
Because the responsibilities behind it, so the persons. I think you can judge it that from that.
Yes, I think it's important to see the whole person, that there are gaps, they might be hiding something for sure. And I find you see that a lot more nowadays too than you used to, that people will leave gaps because they move around more. And then really count that position that year. I wasn't there that long. Hobbies?
It's a little dangerous.
Yeah. Good to know another one where it's good for knowing the whole person, but there's risk that you might get them to bring up the wrong thing. Nope.
Yeah.
Good question. I find that really helpful because if a lot of them have a story they make up that's not the real story, but every now and then you get the real story, right?
Especially when they talk about their previous employers, that's when you get a red flag, like, okay, done.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, talk negative about their boss or their company. Yeah, that's often when it comes out. It was their fault.
Yeah.
Even if it was, it's a little red flag, a big red, that you need to look at. Okay, we discussed that one already. And you notice that somebody's pregnant, and you say, "Oh, what are you expecting?" Which is a natural thing to do, right? We can't, no, I don't see. Okay, and I'm just remembering that interview starts when they walk in the building. So even like if you have a receptionist desk, making sure they're kind of aware of, what to say and not to say. The candidate is a good idea. That's often when it happens, in those casual moments. And then letting them talk, again, I said I'd repeat that a lot, because I've seen so many people that just take you, what Karen was saying when she was hired, that and they just talk and they hire her. So they're so excited over the company and the position. So you wanna dig in, learn, probe, have the opportunity to really see the candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And then after it's over, I recommend, and I'll give Anne Marie a copy of an example of this, is to have a rating sheet, so you, especially if there's a lot of time between candidates, and then you have it documented in a like scientific kind of way, really. I mean, if there's some subjectivity, but you have documentation on why you selected a candidate over another, and it helps me like really look at apples to apples. Because there's like what you call the halo effect, where maybe you love something about the candidate in particular, you know, they're really charismatic and you just bond with them, or they're like you, so you bond with them, and you just connect, and you forget all the other factors, you're blinded by them, or the opposite, with halo the devil, or horns, I forget what that one's called, but, yeah. And I customize these based on the position, of course, the key skills and competency. I was going to take time to do this if we had time, but we're short, so I think this is something that would be good for you to practice on your own, too. But just as a group, let's think of a behavioral-based question. Let's see, we'll say it's for, since there's some of you in the same industry, we'll say it's for a patient care associate, is that what you call it? What's a good behavioral-based interview on a key skill or competency they should have? And that's trying to figure out.
Patients, maybe?
Okay, good.
Understand their situation, especially if the client is Alzheimer's. Be patient with them.
And how might you ask that to see how they've demonstrated patience in the past?
Ask questions like about dementia, what they know about dementia, and how would they approach if they have a client who has dementia.
Good. Or instead of how would, how have
How
they in
have
the
they-
past?
yeah. Yeah.
So maybe it's, can you give me an example of a very tough dementia patient you've handled or interacted with? How did it go? What happened? You know, what was your role in it versus somebody else? Okay. Any questions about that?
Are there any tricks for sort of helping somebody come up with a memory on the spot? I have a really hard time
I have
with
a
that
hard
kind of
time
question.
with that one.
I'm sure it's happened, but my mind's a blank right now.
Well, one, is just give them permission to take time, because people feel like they've got to, you know, instantly, take your time. There's no rush. Think of an example. You give them that time to think and the quiet. I think that's key. And then I've done it where we'll come back to this question later, so that they have more time to sort of be thinking about it as they talk. And sometimes you end up with them coming out with an example that fulfills that anyway, in a different question, through a different question. You get answers to many of your questions at the same time with the same examples. You can check the question off. Did that help? Anybody else have other strategies they might take if a person?
Sometimes, so we're really big on providing good, excellent customer service to our residents. We're all about that customer service experience. So one of my questions is, tell me about a time that you feel like you provided excellent customer service, and if a lot of times they'll think I'm talking about like a retail experience with that. And so then if sometimes they will say, I don't know, I'm having a hard time, and I'll give them time, or I'll say we'll come back to it. And then sometimes I might rephrase it and say, tell me about a time that you feel like you've gone above and beyond for your job, and what did that entail? Or if they're still struggling, I'll say, well, tell me about a time that you feel like you've done more than what was asked of you at your job. And just kind of like try to rephrase it for
good.
them.
Yeah. Give them some more examples of when you might have demonstrated it. Well, if it wasn't a dementia patient, was there another patient that gave difficulty, or get their mind thinking about other situations that would where they'd have to apply the same skills, or have you had a relative that you've helped with the dementia. Okay. Now onboarding. Of course, some people don't think onboarding is as important as it is, but there is a whole lot of research out there showing how important onboarding is. And onboarding it starts after it. You know, some people even argue onboarding starts from your job posting, because you're sending information to the person on what your company stands for, why this job is great, and what it entails. So you're actually starting to orient them, you know, during the beginning from the job posting to what questions you ask in the interview, how you interact with the person during the interview. So some would argue it even starts earlier than that, but then some people think onboarding doesn't start till the day they walk in, and they forget, like maybe you give an offer a month ahead of time. That person's just sitting out there and feeling like a Neverland, wondering what it's like. It's always good to reach out in between and see if they have questions, maybe give them some of their paperwork ahead of time. So, and then, of course, involves the forms. That's what I meant by communications, is keeping in touch with them, you know, helping make sure they're okay, making sure someone is connecting to them, be prepared for their day one, and then it's ongoing, you know, it can be months out. Even at the end of the year, it might be good to survey them, or the end of 6 months, saying how was your experience, so you can make it even better for the next hire. And yeah, think about time. Does anybody have a good example of when they had a terrible experience? And why? Or not so good? It doesn't have to. See, I just reframed the question to help everybody think. I can't think of a bad one. Think of a good experience and why. Some of you have just been running your own businesses and things, so haven't had that many of these.
I worked for a company one time it was therapeutic day treatment, so in a school system, but we were contracted in the school system. And when I showed up for the company starting, they didn't really explain that I was going to be there majority of the day. And then I also had to go out and individually or cover the charges myself for like a background and fingerprinting, and that wasn't really all explained when the position was offered too.
No.
So needless to say, I didn't really stay with that company very long. But yeah, that wasn't the best onboarding situation. All of the hiring costs wasn't explained up front, and just it wasn't very organized.
You lost trust, right?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't terrible, like you said, it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't the smoothest hiring process with that company.
And then that shows that it puts that, you know, if you get off to the wrong foot, it can really damage your whole perception of the company going forward, you know? So it can really damage whether a person stays or goes, and how happy they'll be while they're there. Again, a good study show how critical it is, and first impressions are so important, really being ready for them when they arrive. It's, you know, I remember going into a job and not having a chair. And I was saying, and it would, you know, or you weren't, the manager wasn't there and I didn't know it, you know. It was, it's like, okay. You know, that was who I felt like I had the connection to, but that's okay. So it can really reduce anxiety, increase engagement. It also communicates your expectations. So onboarding is really helps people really kind of get more of a sense of the culture and what's expected of you, from the actual job requirements to the little things like we get to meetings on time. You know, that might help to know that. You know, and we get back to each other in 24 hours. You know, even things like that can help. You know, so I like the HR person doesn't have to do all that. The manager. And maybe you assign a buddy even that helps with some of those things, and maybe even has a checklist to make sure things are covered. But So that the manager might talk about team norms and things like that, specific to the team versus HR handling all that. But we try to prepare our managers to do that. Like at UVA, we had a really good checklist. I was on the team that refined the onboarding process. We had buddy programs where they signed a buddy, and we had a template for what a buddy might cover. Bigger organizations, that's easier than smaller. I find in my current company, it's around 75 employees. The manager's typically the buddy. It's just too small. And they're right. Well, they're not physically there anymore, but they're interacting with them reg. But it helps to have one other person, especially when managers are that real busy type, that's not going to be present enough. And the other buddy can show them the building and the bathrooms and be the one they ask questions they don't want to ask the manager. So, what happens if I'm going to be a little late? What do I do? You know, does the manager get really upset? And then, yeah, it also impacts the speed of them being able to contribute. That helps their confidence and helps you as far as your return on investment. Okay, and that's so important, like to plan the hiring in advance. You know, if you don't have a kind of a standard process that they flow into, let them know ahead what to expect helps a lot of candidates too. Like, you know, ahead of time, this is what your training's going to look like. You know, your first day, your first week, your first month, even depending on the job, and have the schedule like you're going to meet with me for the first hour, and then IT to get your computer going, or so and so to help get your locker set up, and have it all planned out as best you can. Like we might not have everybody scheduled for the next few weeks for onboarding someone, but we have the plan, and then we'll plug in the rest. Any questions about that? I mean, I realize some positions are just somebody always is a trainer, and just so that they're aware. You might not have a plan to hand them, but you told them what to expect. And it's good to do something special to celebrate their arrival, right? Anybody do something with their new hires now? Do you give them a gift or lunch or?
We give gift cards when we hire them.
You do?
First.
Nice. And something with a logo item. Bagel breakfast to meet the rest of the team if they haven't met them. That's something that also I didn't mention in the presentations. When you do interviews and you're trying to decide who's involved, it's, you know, I'd probably involve the team if you can in the second or third interview, so they feel the investment in the process too. They feel like buy-in to the person who's hired. They've met them, know a little bit about what they're like. They've given some input. Sometimes it can really sway. They just see a different angle than you see. Or a manager's hiring me. Again, being available, if you absolutely can't, some emergency comes up, please let the candidate know if at all possible, and have somebody else more senior, somebody who can really show them the ropes, that's going to be responsible for training. By you, I mean the manager. You know, it's good for HR to be there too, but not as essential as the manager. And yeah, having everything set up, we talked about that. And I've had so many employees when I've done that survey, and you ask them what went well. I mean, what they get upset about is my computer took 2 days, and you know, things like that. You know, I didn't have a garbage can or any supplies. I didn't know where to get them. But that computer seems to be biggest, or access if there's a shared system, because that can really delay. And sometimes that's always been my biggest challenge, is for IT to realize that importance too. So.
For having the people on the right distribution list so that they get the announcement of the office lunch that they're the special guest. That happened once.
Yes, that's great. To have a process ahead of time on how those things happen, so they're automated and they don't get forgotten. You know, that's another good checklist for HR. Make sure IT has been notified and set up. And remembering how important first impressions are.
How important, well, I think I know the answer to this question, but letting the other folks in your organization know that this new person is starting such and such a date, you know, please make them feel welcome, introduce yourself, you know, instead of going, oh, who were they? When did they get, you know, that sort of thing.
Important, very, very important, yeah. You know, we at least do it at the big team level. And then shortly after we announce, now with the remote, I guess it's a little different. I think if you're on site, it might be good for people to know ahead if you have a way to do that.
One of the things a former manager I worked for used to do that I loved, we had several different locations, so we were spread out across the state of Virginia. And if someone were starting in, say, the Norfolk office, he would send an email to everyone before they arrived, and like he had a standard list of get to know them questions, like who's the most famous person you ever met, or you know, just tell a little, so you had a couple little nuggets about that person, and you at least knew that they were coming up. You might not ever see them, but you had a little introduction to them.
Oh, good. Yeah.
It took a little extra time, but I really appreciated those.
My current HR director does like a video. She has them video, and some of them are more creative with it or not. She videotapes them telling a little about themselves and puts it out for us. Partly since we're so many of us are remote mostly now. But there's also a I forgot what we called it. We created at UVA where it's there's a fancy name for it, but the manager sends the person a form, the new hire a form before they start, and asks questions like that, and how you like to be rewarded, and then the idea is that the managers then will use it, like, oh, they love chocolate, I'm gonna have chocolate waiting on their desk, and that's a good thing to reward them with later, and the conversation, and that's what you can base your bio on. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. That's something I could put in a resource, in an example of that too, I think. Onboarding. So, yeah, the actual, if you're the manager, just making sure you cover even like things people don't think of are the traditions. It helps people to know how birthdays are handled. We have quarterly get-togethers to just have fun together, or those types of things, and expectations. It's really even good to sit, like whenever you have a new person on the team. Especially if it's not a constantly changing team, like some of your realities might be, to sit down with the team and talk through norms together. Maybe you're not, like if you get a new hire and it's going to impact your team, because there's the forming stage, storming stage, where everybody's figuring out how to work together with the new person, the new dynamics, even if it's brief and easy, and then norming, and then they get to a higher level of performing. So if you can do things to help through that storming stage, like, those things like, okay, let's all agree we get back to each other in 24 hours, and yada yada. I don't want to go too far on that tangent though, but that helps people with those kind of expectations you don't really think about as much that aren't as directly related to the job. And avoiding too much information. That's almost every new hire you see, they have that deer in the headlights with great, they all new, so much information, so many people they're meeting. So if you could maybe even like give them just a real light first day to get situated. I mean, you don't want them to sit idle because then they feel stressed, but where they have computer setup time, some things spread out a little, a break in there where they maybe have the option to be alone in case they need to especially if they're not an extrovert. And making sure they have the tools they need to succeed. The training reduces anxiety. They have that computer, the access is their distribution. Be available for them. you know, make sure the manager or you, if you're HR and not the manager, and assign that buddy is always, even if it's informal, like, you know, if I'm not around, you know, so-and-so is a really good person to go to. They know you might go to them. Yeah. So, that's it. Any questions? Any? How many of you have like a process, a formal process for onboarding now? What are some of the key things you think help make it successful?
Or not successful. The thing that drives me crazy is the very first thing we do is we have a day set aside for orientation. So they start in the morning, they start with me, we go over, the first thing you do is the paperwork so I could do payroll. Okay, they want to be paid. After that, we go over policies and procedures where I also present them with their handbook, which is mandatory to read, and I know I'm going to assume they read it because there's a slip that they have to sign off that they did, whether they do or not, and explain to them. If you choose not to, that's okay, but I'm going to hold you accountable to everything in the book, you know, that type of thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, we've taken a lot of time to really craft it that it's fun, it's informative, it's not overwhelming. We take breaks when anybody needs to. We have snacks there, so if someone is a little hungry, because if you're a little hungry, you're not focused on what you're doing because you're hungry.
Right.
So we always have snacks, we have drinks, whatever, and it's very, very, very informal. It goes from me to my safety manager comes back to me because we use ADP, so I have to create an account, get them in the system now. They walk out of my office, and they've told me this over and over, so I'm not patting myself on the back, but they said, they're psyched. It was a great day, everything's positive, they're psyched, I think. So the very next day, they don't see me. They just punch in because I've gotten them in time clock, and they go to their manager or supervisor who's waiting for them to take them to their department and to show them the ropes. And then it just falls apart. Because they're so busy, because our team is so busy working, they forget that this person doesn't know what to do and that they really need that training. You know, you can't train someone for an hour.
Yeah.
And they tend to say, oh, well, just like watch me. But I said, no, you have to understand why you're doing, what you're doing has to have meaning in order for you to do it successfully, at least for us. And it just inevitably, because I'm always checking on these people because I see them almost every day. Hey, how's it going? How's the training coming along? And time again, they said, yeah, it just falls apart. It just falls apart. So we keep trying to, then when we have our senior staff meeting, I'm constantly the one bringing it up. What can we do better? How can we? And I said, look, I don't want them to leave me and our safety manager after day one super psyched only to then be disappointed.
Yeah.
Because then it's like, oh.
So that planning ahead and working with those managers and
Yeah.
make sure they have a good plan.
Yeah.
To hand.
And I think part of it, and I don't know if anyone else struggles with this, is we run very lean. It's not like we have a whole lot of people who have the time to really dedicate. And I understand that. I always say in our staff meetings, it's like, I know you don't have the time, but the time you invest now is paid back over all these years when you don't have to do it. You know, and I just can't get it through their heads. And then I have people, they continue to work for us, but they don't have that enthusiasm. They don't have that, they're not as invested in the success of the company as I want them to be.
That's really great that you can get them motivated. I hope that you can work it out to continue it, because that I didn't talk any really about the orientation and how that can be so important. Getting, not just doing paperwork, but giving them some inspiration to get started
Right.
with, whether it's you yourself or you bring in some leaders or, you know, it's really helping. I find that the new hires are usually have we have an umbilical cord for a while after they start. I'm like their person, like they feel like I'm mom sort of, you know, for a while, and I think that gives them a good feeling. And it sounds like you've done that, but we're over.
Oh.
Over.